Marcus Rodriguez had never expected his childhood in the Amazon rainforest to prepare him for representing humanity among the stars. Yet here he was, standing in the gleaming corridors of the Nexus Prime space station, surrounded by the most feared predators in the known galaxy. The invitation had come through official channels, delivered by the Galactic Council with the weight of interstellar diplomacy. Your species has been selected for the Apex trial, the message had stated in formal universal standard. One representative may attempt the challenge. Success grants admission to the Predator's Circle. Failure results in educational value. Marcus adjusted his worn leather jacket. A gift from his father, who had worked as a jaguar researcher in the deep Amazon. The familiar weight of his machete hung at his side, along with other tools that had passed the station's security screening as primitive implements of negligible threat value. The aliens had no idea what a human could accomplish with simple steel and plant fiber. The guide construct led him through passages that shifted color and temperature to accommodate different species' needs. Marcus noted how the environmental controls worked, filing the information away with the automatic awareness of someone who had learned to read his surroundings for survival. Even in this artificial environment, there were patterns to observe and weaknesses to exploit. The main assembly chamber was vast, with viewing platforms arranged in tiers around a central arena. Representatives from dozens of species filled the observation areas, their conversations creating a symphony of growls, clicks, harmonics, and electromagnetic pulses that his translator could barely process. At the center of the chamber stood four figures that commanded immediate attention. These were the current members of the Predator's Circle, the most elite hunting organization in the galaxy. The first was a Kithrak, standing 3 meters tall on 6 powerful legs. Its exoskeleton gleamed like polished chrome, and the 4 arms that emerged from its torso ended in claws that could shred steel. Scar patterns etched into its carapace told the story of countless successful hunts across worlds where gravity could crush lesser beings. Beside it floated a Nethys, its tentacled form undulating within a containment field filled with corrosive atmosphere. Marcus had read that the Nethys could phase through most known materials, and possessed sensory organs that could detect prey across entire star systems. Their homeworld was a gas giant, where they hunted creatures the size of space stations. The third member was something that hurt to look at directly. The Void Dancer appeared as a constantly shifting shadow that bent light around itself in impossible ways. Marcus's eyes watered when he tried to focus on it, but he could sense its attention like ice water in his veins. These beings hunted in the vacuum of space itself, feeding on cosmic radiation and stellar wind. But it was the fourth member that made Marcus's blood run cold. The Hive Queen stood motionless, but he could see the thousands of smaller forms moving beneath her translucent skin. She was not just a predator but an entire ecosystem of predators, each specialized for different aspects of the hunt. Her species had conquered 17 worlds before joining the Circle, turning entire planets into hunting preserves. Human Marcus Rodriguez, the Kithrak, spoke first, its voice a rumble that resonated through the chamber floor. I am Hunt Master Vexthal. You stand before the Predator's Circle, the finest hunters in known space. Each of us has mastered our native hunting grounds and proven our worth against the most dangerous prey in the galaxy. The Nethys pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that his translator interpreted as communication. I am Deep Hunter Al-Soth. The Apex trial has existed for 7,000 standard years. In that time, over 800 species have attempted it. Only 4 have succeeded in earning membership in our circle. The Void Dancer's voice seemed to come from inside Marcus's head, bypassing his ears entirely. I am silence that hunts. The trial is not merely a test of hunting ability, it measures the fundamental predatory nature that separates apex species from prey animals. Most candidates fail to understand this distinction. Finally, the Hive Queen spoke with a voice like rustling leaves, each word accompanied by the subtle movement of the forms beneath her skin. I am Nest Mother. Zeeth Ara, your species intrigues us, human. You come from what you call a death world, yet you appear physically unremarkable. Your technology is primitive compared to most spacefaring civilizations, yet reports from your border territories suggest hunting capabilities that warrant investigation. Marcus nodded respectfully, keeping his expression neutral despite the awe he felt in the presence of these legendary predators. I'm honored by the invitation. What exactly does the Apex trial involve? Huntmaster Vexisthal gestured toward the arena floor, which began to shift and reconfigure itself. The trial takes place in a controlled environment that replicates the hunting grounds of our respective species. You must successfully stalk and capture prey in each of our native habitats, using only the tools and techniques natural to your species. The arena floor divided into 4 distinct sections. Marcus could see a high-gravity rocky wasteland, where massive creatures moved like living mountains. Beyond that, a section filled with corrosive mist, where shapes flickered in and out of visibility. The third area was a perfect void, dotted with floating asteroids and cosmic phenomena. The final section was a dense ecosystem, where everything seemed to be both predator and prey simultaneously. The challenge, continued Deep Hunter Aelsoth, is not simply to hunt, but to adapt your hunting methods to environments and prey types that no human has ever encountered. Each section contains creatures specifically chosen to test the limits of predatory capability. Silence. That Hunts added. Most species attempt to apply their native hunting strategies universally, failing when they encounter environments that nullify their evolutionary advantages. True apex predators must transcend the limitations of their birth world. Nest mother Xythara pulsed with internal movement. The prey species in each section are not mere animals. They are intelligent beings with their own hunting capabilities, selected from among the most dangerous non-apex species in the galaxy. They will learn from your tactics and adapt their defenses accordingly. Marcus studied the 4 hunting grounds, his mind automatically analyzing sightlines, cover opportunities, and environmental hazards. Growing up in the Amazon, he had learned that every ecosystem had its own rules, but certain principles remained constant across all environments. What are the rules regarding tools and techniques? You may use only what you bring with you and what you can craft from materials found within the trial environment, Vexthul explained. Energy weapons, technological enhancement devices, and external assistance are forbidden. The trial measures your worth as a natural predator, not your civilization's engineering capabilities. Marcus touched the handle of his machete, feeling the familiar groove worn by his father's hand and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of his family had lived in the deep jungle, learning to read the forest's moods and move through its dangers. The tools he carried were simple, but they represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to survive and hunt in the world's most challenging environment. When do I begin? Immediately. Silence, that Hunts replied. Time is a factor in the trial. The longer you take to adapt to each environment, the more opportunity your prey has to study your methods and develop countermeasures. Previous candidates who succeeded did so through rapid adaptation and innovative thinking. A transport platform descended from the ceiling, its surface rippling like liquid metal before solidifying. Marcus stepped aboard and felt the familiar sensation of controlled descent as it carried him down to the arena floor. He found himself in a circular staging area at the center of the 4 hunting grounds. The ground beneath his feet was a neutral gray material that provided good traction, and the air was carefully maintained at comfortable temperature and pressure. 4 archways led to the different environments, each one marked with symbols that his translator identified as the territories of the circle members. Marcus approached each archway in turn, studying the environments beyond without entering them. The high-gravity section registered as Kithrak territory, where the prey would be massive and powerful but likely slow-moving. The corrosive mist environment belonged to the Nethys, suggesting prey that relied on camouflage and chemical defenses. The void section was clearly the domain of silence that hunts, where prey would use the 3-dimensional nature of space and cosmic phenomena for protection. The dense ecosystem belonged to nest mother Zethara, where everything was interconnected, and the boundary between predator and prey was fluid. But Marcus had learned something during his years in the Amazon that none of these apex predators seemed to have considered. The jungle had taught him that the most successful hunting strategy wasn't about overpowering prey or outcompeting other predators. It was about understanding the ecosystem itself and finding ways to work with natural processes rather than against them. He began with the Kithrak territory, stepping through the archway into an environment where gravity immediately tried to crush him to the ground. Marcus had experienced something similar during his military service in mountain training, but this was far more extreme. Each step required conscious effort, and he could feel his cardiovascular system working harder to maintain circulation. The landscape was a maze of rocky formations and boulder fields where creatures the size of bulldozers moved with surprising grace despite their bulk. These were the Kithrak's native prey species, Marcus realized, beings that had evolved in crushing gravity until they became living tanks, their hide thick enough to deflect energy weapons, and their strength sufficient to shatter stone with casual movements. Traditional hunting approaches would be suicide here. The creatures were too large to bring down with conventional weapons, too strong to restrain with normal techniques, and too well armored to damage with anything Marcus carried. But watching them move through their environment, Marcus began to notice patterns that reminded him of something from his jungle experience. The creatures followed established paths between feeding areas, their massive weight wearing grooves in the stone over countless generations. They moved in predictable patterns, following the most energy-efficient routes between resources. Most importantly, they were creatures of habit, following behavioral routines that could be analyzed and predicted. Marcus had once helped his father track a jaguar that had been taking livestock from local villages. The key hadn't been overpowering the jaguar or out-completing it in direct confrontation. Instead, they had studied its territorial patterns, identified choke points in its movement routes, and used the jaguar's own behavioral predictability to guide it into a capture situation. The same principle could work here. But Marcus needed to understand the alien environment better first. He spent several hours observing the creature's behavior, noting how they interacted with their surroundings and each other. Gradually, he began to see the underlying patterns that governed their movement and feeding cycles. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the creature's massive size was both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. They required enormous amounts of energy to function, which meant they had to follow highly efficient behavioral patterns. Any deviation from their optimal movement routes would cost them more energy than they could afford to expend. Marcus began crafting his capture strategy using techniques adapted from pitfall trapping, but modified for the extreme environment and massive prey. Instead of trying to create a pit large enough to contain one of these creatures, he focused on creating a situation where the creature's own momentum and size would work against it. The rocky terrain provided abundant material for his plan. Marcus spent most of a day carefully moving stones and debris to create a false path that looked like a natural route, but actually led to a carefully engineered dead end. The key was making the deception subtle enough that the creature's danger-sensing instincts wouldn't trigger until they were already committed to the false route. When the trap was ready, Marcus positioned himself to drive one of the smaller creatures toward his prepared area. He didn't try to chase or frighten the creature directly. Instead, he used techniques his grandfather had taught him for herding wild pigs through dense forest, creating subtle disturbances that would make the creature choose to move in the direction Marcus wanted. The technique worked perfectly. The creature, following what appeared to be a normal path, found itself in Marcus's prepared dead end, with no room to turn around and insufficient space to back out. The trap held the creature securely but harmlessly, using its own size and the terrain's limitations to create containment without injury. Marcus approached his captive carefully, noting the intelligence in its eyes and the lack of panic in its behavior. Like all successful prey species, it was capable of learning and adapting. He spent several minutes demonstrating that he meant no harm, offering water from his canteen and showing the creature how the trap mechanism worked. When Marcus released the creature by clearing the debris that blocked its escape route, it studied him for a long moment before moving away. But Marcus noticed that it didn't flee in panic. Instead, it moved with what appeared to be curiosity, occasionally looking back as if trying to understand what had just happened. The successful capture in the high-gravity environment had taken most of a day, but Marcus felt confident about his approach to the remaining challenges. The key was remembering that every environment had its own rules, but successful hunting always came down to understanding those rules and working with them rather than fighting against them. As Marcus made his way back to the staging area to rest and prepare for the next environment, he became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the observation areas above. The representatives from dozens of species were watching his every movement, with an intensity that suggested they had never seen anything quite like his approach to the trial. In the viewing area reserved for the predator's circle, the 4 apex predators were engaged in what appeared to be intense discussion. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language suggested that his success in the Keithrak territory had surprised them. What they were discussing, Marcus would learn later, was the realization that humans might represent something unprecedented in galactic predatory evolution. Most apex species achieved their status through superior physical capabilities, advanced technology, or highly specialized hunting techniques. But Marcus was demonstrating something different: the ability to analyze any environment and develop effective strategies using nothing but observation, creativity, and simple tools. The jungle had taught him that adaptation was more valuable than specialization, and that understanding was more powerful than overwhelming force. As Marcus prepared to enter the Nethys territory with its corrosive mists and camouflaged predators, he carried with him not just the tools of his ancestors but the accumulated wisdom of a species that had learned to thrive in the most diverse and challenging environment their world had to offer. The Amazon rainforest had been humanity's teacher, and Marcus Rodriguez was about to show the galaxy what that education could accomplish. The transition into the Nethys territory felt like stepping into a toxic nightmare. The corrosive mists that filled the environment immediately began eating away at any exposed metal on Marcus's equipment, and the air itself seemed to burn his throat despite the protective membrane that formed around him as he crossed the threshold. Marcus pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, grateful for the cotton fabric that would provide some filtration. The mists swirled around him in patterns that seemed almost alive, shifting colors from green to purple to an oily black that hurt to look at directly. Visibility was limited to perhaps 10 meters in any direction, and the chemical haze made his eyes water constantly. This environment was designed to challenge even the Nethys, beings who thrived in corrosive atmospheres and could phase through solid matter at will. The prey species here would have evolved specialized defenses against chemical attacks, and they would use the limited visibility to their advantage in ways that conventional hunters couldn't match. Marcus had encountered something similar during a research expedition in a volcanic region of the Amazon, where sulfur springs created toxic gas pockets that could kill in minutes. His father had taught him that the key to surviving in such environments wasn't just protection from the toxins, but understanding how they moved and where they concentrated. He began by studying the mist patterns, noting how they flowed around obstacles and gathered in low-lying areas. The artificial environment was designed to simulate alien conditions, but the basic physics of gas movement remained constant. Heavier gases would settle in depressions, while lighter components would rise and disperse. More importantly, any creatures adapted to this environment would have evolved behavioral patterns that took advantage of these physical laws. Marcus spent his first hour mapping the safe zones within the territory, identifying areas where the mists were thinner, or where air currents provided temporary relief from the chemical assault. He found that certain rock formations created eddy currents that cleared the air for brief moments, and some areas had underground vents that drew away the worst concentrations of toxic vapor. The breakthrough in understanding came when Marcus noticed that the mists weren't uniform in composition. Different areas had different chemical signatures, visible as subtle color variations in the swirling gases. Some zones were highly acidic, others were alkaline, and a few areas contained gases that seemed to neutralize each other when they mixed. This gave Marcus the key insight he needed. In the Amazon, he had learned that many toxic plants produced compounds that were dangerous individually, but neutralized each other when combined correctly. Indigenous peoples had used this knowledge for centuries, creating antidotes from the same environments that produced poisons. The prey species in this environment would have evolved similar adaptations. They would know which areas were safe, which chemicals could be neutralized, and how to move through the toxic maze without sustaining damage. More importantly, they would use their knowledge of the chemical environment as both a defensive mechanism and a hunting tool. Marcus began crafting a filtering system, using materials from his pack and resources gathered from the environment itself. His cotton shirt could be used as a basic particulate filter, but he needed something more sophisticated to deal with the chemical components. The rock formations in some areas showed mineral deposits that suggested natural buffering compounds, materials that could neutralize acid or base attacks. He collected samples of these minerals and began testing them against different types of mist, using techniques his grandfather had taught him for identifying edible plants in unfamiliar environments. Some minerals produced violent reactions when exposed to certain chemicals, but others created neutralizing effects that cleared the air temporarily. Working methodically, Marcus developed a primitive but effective gas mask using layered filtering materials. The outer layer was designed to handle particulates and the heaviest chemical compounds. The middle layer contained neutralizing minerals that would buffer acid-base reactions. The inner layer was fine cotton that would catch any remaining particles before they reached his respiratory system. The filtering system wasn't perfect, but it gave Marcus the protection he needed to move more freely through the environment. More importantly, it allowed him to stay in areas where the toxic concentrations would normally force him to retreat, giving him opportunities to observe the native prey species in their natural behavior patterns. His first sighting of the Nethys prey came after several hours of patient observation. The creature materialized out of the mists like a living shadow, its form shifting between solid and gaseous states as it moved through the chemical environment. It was roughly humanoid in shape but seemed to be composed of the same toxic vapors that filled the territory, making it nearly impossible to distinguish from the surrounding atmosphere. Marcus watched as the creature moved through the mists with perfect confidence, never hesitating or showing signs of discomfort from the chemical exposure. Its hunting technique was immediately apparent. It would merge with the toxic environment until it was virtually invisible, then strike at prey that wandered into its carefully prepared ambush zones. The creature's camouflage was so perfect that Marcus lost sight of it several times, only to spot it again when it moved against the flow of the surrounding mists. This gave him the insight he needed to develop a tracking strategy based on environmental disruption rather than direct observation. In the Amazon, Marcus had learned to track jaguars not by following their physical traces, but by reading the subtle ways they disturbed their environment. Birds would change their calls when a predator passed nearby. Insects would go silent in specific patterns. Even the humidity and air movement would shift as large predators moved through the forest canopy. The same principles applied here, but with chemical signatures instead of biological ones. When the gaseous predator moved through the mists, it created pressure waves and chemical gradients that were detectable if you knew what to look for. The creature's passage would temporarily change the color and flow patterns of the surrounding gases, creating a trail that could be followed even when the predator itself was invisible. Marcus spent another day learning to read these chemical signatures, developing an intuitive understanding of how the creature's movements affected the local environment. He discovered that the predator had established hunting territories within the larger environment, areas where it had modified the chemical composition to create optimal ambush conditions. But Marcus also noticed something the creature might not have realized about its own behavior. Its perfect adaptation to the chemical environment made it predictable in subtle ways. It always chose paths that minimized its exposure to neutralizing reactions, avoided areas where different chemical types mixed, and maintained specific distance from the mineral formations that could disrupt its gaseous form. These behavioral patterns gave Marcus the opening he needed. Instead of trying to track the creature directly, he began modifying the chemical environment itself, using the neutralizing minerals he had discovered to create zones where the creature's camouflage would be less effective. The technique was similar to something his father had used when studying poison dart frogs in the deep Amazon. Instead of trying to capture the frogs directly, they had modified small sections of the environment to create conditions where the frog's natural behaviors would bring them to specific locations at predictable times. Marcus began by identifying a choke point in the creature's territory, a narrow passage between two large rock formations that the predator used regularly to move between hunting areas. Then he carefully placed neutralizing minerals in strategic locations around the passage, creating a chemical gradient that would force the creature to solidify briefly as it passed through. The setup took most of a day to complete, requiring Marcus to work slowly and carefully to avoid alerting the creature to his presence. He used techniques learned during jungle warfare training, moving with deliberate patience and timing his activities to coincide with the natural flow patterns of the toxic mists. When the trap was ready, Marcus positioned himself in one of the safe zones he had identified earlier and waited. The key to successful ambush hunting, his grandfather had taught him, was infinite patience. combined with perfect timing. You could wait for hours or days for the right moment. But when it came, you had to act with absolute precision. The creature appeared just as Marcus had predicted, following its established route through the narrow passage. As it entered the zone where Marcus had placed his chemical barriers, its gaseous form began to interact with the neutralizing minerals, forcing it to take on a more solid configuration to maintain its integrity. Marcus had prepared a containment system adapted from techniques used to capture bats in cave environments. Instead of a simple net or trap, he used the chemical properties of the environment itself to create a localized zone where the creature's gaseous abilities would be temporarily neutralized, forcing it into a solid form that could be safely contained. The capture went exactly as planned. The creature found itself temporarily solidified and contained within a chemically neutral zone, unharmed but unable to phase back into gaseous form until the neutralizing effects wore off. Marcus approached carefully, noting the intelligence and curiosity in the creature's behavior, rather than fear or panic. Up close, the creature was even more remarkable than Marcus had realized. Its form seemed to be composed of living chemicals, organized into complex patterns that suggested consciousness and intelligence. When Marcus demonstrated how his chemical neutralization trap worked, the creature responded with what appeared to be appreciation for the elegance of the technique. Marcus spent several minutes ensuring the creature was comfortable and unharmed, before reversing the chemical reactions that held it in solid form. As the neutralizing effects dissipated, the creature gradually returned to its gaseous state. But it didn't immediately flee. Instead, it seemed to study Marcus's filtering system and the modifications he had made to the local environment. When the creature finally departed, it left behind a small sample of its own chemical composition, a gesture that Marcus interpreted as a sign of respect between hunters. The sample would provide protection against some of the more dangerous chemical combinations in the environment, a gift that demonstrated the creature's sophisticated understanding of chemistry and survival. Marcus made his way back to the staging area, feeling confident about his progress but also increasingly aware of the complexity of the challenges ahead. 2 successful captures had demonstrated his ability to adapt human hunting techniques to alien environments, but the remaining territories would test different aspects of his capabilities. The observation deck above was now packed with representatives from species throughout the galaxy, many of whom had traveled significant distances to witness the trial. Marcus could see that his unconventional approach was generating intense discussion among the observers, with heated debates taking place in dozens of different languages and communication methods. In the Predator's Circle viewing area, the 4 apex predators were engaged in what appeared to be increasingly serious deliberations. Deep Hunter Al-Soth pulsed with rapid bioluminescent patterns that Marcus's translator could barely process, while Silence That Hunts had solidified into its most substantial form, a sign of deep concentration among its species. What Marcus couldn't know was that his success in the chemical environment had revealed something unprecedented about human adaptability. Most species that succeeded in the apex trial did so by applying superior versions of their native hunting strategies, but Marcus was demonstrating the ability to completely reinvent his approach for each environment, using principles that seemed to be universal among successful predators regardless of their evolutionary background. Huntmaster Vex Thull was particularly intrigued by Marcus's use of environmental modification as a hunting tool. The Kithrak had evolved in high-gravity environments where such techniques were impossible, and they had never encountered a species that could analyze an alien ecosystem quickly enough to modify it for tactical advantage. Nest Mother Zethara's reaction was more complex. Her species had conquered worlds by overwhelming them with superior numbers and specialized biological adaptations. But Marcus was achieving similar results using nothing but observation, creativity, and simple tools. The implications for human expansion into galactic territories were becoming impossible to ignore. As Marcus prepared to enter the Void territory for his 3rd challenge, he carried with him not just the confidence of 2 successful captures, but a growing understanding of what made human hunting strategies unique in galactic terms. The jungle had taught him that every environment had its own rules, but also that those rules could be learned, understood, and ultimately used to advantage by any intelligent being willing to observe and adapt. The Void territory that awaited him would test this philosophy in the most extreme way possible, challenging him to hunt in an environment where the normal rules of physics and biology barely applied. But Marcus had learned in the Amazon that the most hostile environments often provided the greatest opportunities for those who could understand their hidden patterns. The third challenge would determine whether human adaptability extended beyond planetary environments into the realm of space itself, where the prey moved through three-dimensional void and could use cosmic phenomena as both weapons and shields. It was a test that would push Marcus's jungle-learned skills to their absolute limits, forcing him to apply terrestrial hunting wisdom to conditions that no Earth-born creature had ever evolved to handle. But as Marcus stood at the threshold of the void territory, adjusting his equipment and preparing his mind for the challenge ahead, he felt the same calm confidence that had carried him through countless dangerous situations in the Amazon. Every environment had patterns that could be learned, and every predator species had behavioral traits that could be understood and predicted. The void might be alien and hostile beyond anything Earth had ever produced, but it was still an environment, and Marcus Rodriguez was about to demonstrate what a human could accomplish when armed with nothing more than centuries of jungle wisdom and the determination to adapt. Stepping into the void territory felt like falling off the edge of reality. Marcus found himself floating in perfect darkness, surrounded by nothing but the distant glow of artificial stars and the eerie beauty of cosmic phenomena that had no earthly equivalent. The sensation of weightlessness was disorienting, and he had to fight down a wave of vertigo as his inner ear struggled to adapt to the absence of gravity. This was the domain of silence that hunts, where predators and prey moved through three-dimensional space using the cosmic environment itself as both weapon and camouflage. Marcus could see scattered asteroids floating in the distance, some glowing with their own internal light, others creating shadows that seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. The void was not truly empty. Energy fields crackled between floating debris, creating a web of deadly lightning that would instantly kill anything that blundered into it. Solar wind from the artificial star created pressure currents that could be used for movement, but also posed the danger of being swept into one of the lethal energy barriers. Marcus had never experienced anything like this environment, but his time in the Amazon canopy had taught him to think in three dimensions. Moving through the forest canopy required constant awareness of multiple levels of terrain, understanding how different routes connected, and developing an intuitive sense of spatial relationships that ground-based hunters never needed. The key insight came when Marcus realized that the void environment operated on principles similar to the forest canopy, but inverted. Instead of branches and vines connecting different levels of terrain, gravity wells and energy fields created pathways through space. Instead of avoiding predators that moved above and below, he needed to be aware of threats that could approach from any direction in three-dimensional space. Marcus began by studying the movement of debris and energy patterns, learning to read the invisible currents that flowed through the void. The artificial stellar wind created pressure gradients that could be used for movement, while gravitational fields around larger asteroids provided opportunities for acceleration and course changes. But understanding the environment was only the first challenge. Marcus needed to locate and study the prey species that inhabited this cosmic hunting ground. The creatures that lived here would have evolved abilities that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would instantly kill most planetary life forms. His first sighting came when a piece of space debris that he had been using as a navigation marker suddenly moved in a way that violated the local gravity field. Marcus focused his attention on the object and realized it wasn't debris at all, but a living creature that had evolved perfect camouflage for the void environment. The creature was roughly the size of a small spacecraft, its body apparently composed of the same materials as the surrounding asteroids. But Marcus could see now that its camouflage was active rather than passive. It was continuously adjusting its appearance to match whatever background it was positioned against, creating the illusion of being an inanimate object. Watching the creature's behavior patterns, Marcus began to understand its hunting strategy. It would position itself along the natural movement corridors created by gravitational fields and energy currents, waiting for prey to pass within striking range. When a target appeared, the creature would use the cosmic environment itself to accelerate toward its victim, striking with the force of a guided missile. The creature's perfect adaptation to the void environment made it nearly invulnerable to conventional hunting techniques. It could survive in hard vacuum, resist energy weapons, and use the three-dimensional nature of space to escape from any ground-based predator strategies. But Marcus had learned something during his years moving through the forest canopy that applied even here. The most successful tree-dwelling predators weren't the ones with the best camouflage or the fastest movement. They were the ones that understood the behavioral patterns of their prey and could predict where their targets would be rather than chasing where they had been. Marcus began mapping the creature's territory, noting which asteroids it used as camouflage positions and which energy currents it favored for movement. More importantly, he started tracking the smaller creatures that served as the predator's prey, learning their movement patterns and feeding behaviors. The prey animals were fascinating in their own right. They appeared to be some kind of space-adapted creatures that fed on cosmic radiation and solar particles, moving through the void in complex migration patterns that followed the energy fields between artificial stellar bodies. They traveled in groups for protection, but their predictable movement routes made them vulnerable to ambush predators like the camouflaged hunter Marcus was tracking. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the creature's hunting success depended on its ability to predict the migration patterns of its prey. It would position itself days in advance along routes that the prey animals used regularly, waiting with infinite patience for the right opportunity to strike. Marcus could use the same predictive approach. But instead of trying to ambush the creature directly, he would position himself to intercept it when it was focused on its own hunting activities. The moment when a predator was concentrated on stalking its prey was often when it was most vulnerable to being hunted itself. The plan required Marcus to solve the challenge of movement in three-dimensional space, using only the tools and materials available to him. His machete was useless in this environment, and his rope would only help if he could find something to anchor it to. But Marcus had noticed that some of the smaller asteroids contained metallic deposits that showed magnetic properties when exposed to the energy fields that permeated the void. Working with materials stripped from his own equipment, Marcus constructed a primitive magnetic grappling system that would allow him to navigate between asteroids without relying on the dangerous energy currents. The system wasn't elegant, but it gave him the mobility he needed to position himself for an intercept attempt. Marcus spent 2 days learning to move through the void environment, developing techniques for using gravitational fields and magnetic attractions to control his movement. It was exhausting work that required constant concentration, but gradually he developed the three-dimensional navigation skills needed to hunt in space. The capture attempt came when Marcus positioned himself along the route he had predicted the void predator would use to intercept a group of migrating prey animals. The creature appeared exactly where Marcus had calculated, moving with silent grace through the cosmic environment toward its chosen ambush position. Marcus used a technique adapted from catching monkeys in the forest canopy, where the key was to use the animal's own momentum and reflexes against it. As the creature passed near his concealed position, Marcus activated a magnetic pulse using a device he had constructed from components of his equipment. The magnetic pulse disrupted the creature's camouflage system temporarily, making it visible against the void background. More importantly, it triggered the creature's defensive reflexes, causing it to alter course away from what it perceived as a potential threat. Marcus had positioned his capture system along the creature's most likely escape route, using its own predatory instincts to guide it into containment. The containment system itself was based on the principle of a lobster trap, easy to enter but difficult to escape from. Marcus had used the gravitational fields around a cluster of asteroids to create a zone where the creature's normal movement abilities would work against it. Once inside the gravity well, the creature would find it extremely difficult to generate enough velocity to escape, but it would be completely unharmed by the capture process. The technique worked perfectly. The void predator found itself contained within Marcus's gravitational trap, unable to build up sufficient momentum to break free but showing no signs of distress or panic. Up close, Marcus could see that the creature was even more remarkable than he had realized, with sophisticated biological systems that allowed it to thrive in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Marcus spent considerable time demonstrating to the creature that he meant no harm, sharing water and food in gestures that seemed to transcend species barriers. When he released it by disrupting the gravitational configuration of his trap, the creature spent several minutes studying his techniques before departing with what appeared to be respectful acknowledgement of his abilities. The final challenge awaited in Nest Mother Sithara's territory, an environment so complex and interconnected that it hurt Marcus's head to contemplate. This was an ecosystem where everything was simultaneously predator, prey, and environment. plants that could think, animals that photosynthesized, and predators that were actually colonial organisms made up of hundreds of individual creatures working in perfect coordination. Marcus had encountered something similar in the deep Amazon, where the relationships between different species were so complex that it was often impossible to determine where one organism ended and another began. Fungal networks connected trees across vast distances, allowing them to share resources and information. Ant colonies cultivated gardens and domesticated other insects. Parasites controlled the behavior of their hosts to such a degree that the distinction between parasite and host became meaningless. The territory was a living maze of interconnected organisms, each one serving multiple functions within the greater ecosystem. What appeared to be trees were actually colonial animals. What looked like flowers were sensory organs for vast underground networks. What seemed like simple insects were actually the mobile components of larger organisms that existed primarily as distributed intelligence. The prey species Marcus needed to capture was described as a hive-mind persistence hunter, which suggested a creature that thought and acted as a collective intelligence while maintaining the relentless pursuit, strategies that characterized the most successful predators. It would be like trying to hunt a creature that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, with perfect coordination between all its components. Marcus spent his first day in the territory simply observing, trying to understand the basic rules that governed this alien ecosystem. Gradually, he began to recognize patterns in the apparent chaos. The territorial boundaries weren't marked by physical barriers but by subtle changes in the relationships between different organisms. Information flowed through the ecosystem along pathways that were invisible but could be detected by changes in behavior and chemical signals. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the hive-mind predator wasn't a separate entity within the ecosystem, but was actually a temporary configuration of the ecosystem itself. When hunting conditions were right, certain components of the environment would reorganize themselves into a collective hunting intelligence, pursuing prey with perfect coordination until the hunt was complete, at which point they would return to their normal ecological functions. This was predation on a level that Marcus had never imagined, but it reminded him of something his grandfather had told him about the way indigenous peoples understood the forest. "The jungle doesn't hunt," the old man had said. "The jungle is the hunt. Everything is connected. And when you understand the connections, you become part of the hunting system instead of fighting against it." Marcus began working to understand the signal systems that triggered the formation of the collective hunting intelligence. Like a conductor learning to read an orchestra, he studied the subtle communications that flowed between different components of the ecosystem, learning to recognize the patterns that preceded a hunt. The insight that led to his capture strategy came when Marcus realized that the hive-mind predator's greatest strength was also its most exploitable weakness. The perfect coordination between its components required constant communication through biochemical signals. If those signals could be disrupted or redirected, the collective intelligence would lose its coherence temporarily. Using techniques adapted from traditional hunting practices, where hunters would use animal calls to confuse and redirect their prey, Marcus began producing biochemical signals that mimicked the ecosystem's natural communication methods. But instead of simply disrupting the signals, he created false patterns that would cause part of the collective intelligence to reorganize itself into a configuration that could be safely contained. The capture itself was the most complex operation Marcus had attempted during the entire trial. It required him to simultaneously manipulate multiple components of the ecosystem, timing his interventions precisely to create a temporary reorganization of the collective hunting intelligence. When the technique succeeded, part of the hive mind found itself configured into a stable formation that maintained its intelligence and awareness, but was unable to disperse back into the larger ecosystem. Marcus spent considerable time communicating with the captured collective intelligence, using biochemical signals to demonstrate his respect for its capabilities and his intention to cause no harm. The hive mind's response was a complex pattern of chemical communications that Marcus interpreted as curiosity and approval of his methods. When Marcus released the collective intelligence by removing the signal disruptions that held it in configuration, the hive mind's components began flowing back into their normal ecological roles. But before the reorganization was complete, the ecosystem produced a gift for Marcus: a small symbiotic organism that would provide him with enhanced sensory capabilities and protection against biological threats. As Marcus made his way back to the staging area for the final time, he became aware of the profound silence that had fallen over the observation areas. The viewing platforms that had been filled with excited discussion and debate throughout his trial were now occupied by thousands of representatives from across the galaxy, all watching in complete stillness. The Predator's circle was waiting for him in the central arena, their expressions unreadable but their posture suggesting a fundamental shift in how they viewed both Marcus and humanity in general. Huntmaster Vex Thule spoke first, his voice carrying a tone of formal respect that hadn't been present during their initial meeting. Human Marcus Rodriguez, you have completed the Apex trial in a manner unprecedented in our records. Not only have you successfully captured prey from each of our territories, but you have done so using methods that none of our species had previously encountered. Deep Hunter Ale Soth pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that Marcus's translator interpreted as profound admiration. Your approach to each environment demonstrated capabilities that suggest humans have evolved hunting strategies that transcend environmental limitations. This has significant implications for our understanding of predatory evolution. Silence that hunts had solidified into its most substantial form, a sign of deep respect among its species. We have observed thousands of apex predators from across the galaxy. Each successful species demonstrates mastery of their native hunting grounds and the ability to adapt their techniques to similar environments. But you have shown the ability to develop entirely new hunting strategies for each alien environment you encountered. Nest Mother Zethara's response was the most complex, accompanied by the movement of countless organisms beneath her translucent skin. Your success in our territory was particularly remarkable. You demonstrated understanding of collective intelligence principles that we had assumed were unique to our species. This suggests that humans have evolved cognitive capabilities that allow them to interface with any form of intelligence they encounter. The formal conclusion of the trial involved ceremonies that Marcus only partially understood, but the essential message was unmistakable. Humanity had not only earned membership in the Predator's circle but had done so in a way that fundamentally altered the circle's understanding of what apex predation could involve. The Predator's circle has existed for 7,000 years, Vex Thule announced to the assembled observers. During that time, we have identified and inducted the galaxy's most successful hunting species, each bringing unique capabilities to our collective knowledge. Today, we welcome the fifth member of our circle, representatives of a species that has demonstrated hunting capabilities unlike anything in our previous experience. Amen. The implications extended far beyond simple membership in an elite organization. As Marcus would learn in the days that followed, his success in the trial had demonstrated that humans possessed adaptability that could potentially allow them to thrive in any environment the galaxy had to offer. The political and economic ramifications of this revelation would reshape interstellar relations for generations to come. But in the immediate moment, as Marcus stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by the most feared predators in known space, he felt the same quiet satisfaction that had always come from successful hunts in the Amazon. Every environment had its own rules and patterns, and with enough observation and patience, those patterns could be learned and understood. The jungle had taught him that the greatest predators weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest, but the ones that could adapt to any situation while respecting the intelligence and capabilities of both their prey and their environment. As the newest member of the Predator's circle, Marcus Rodriguez carried with him not just the hunting wisdom of his ancestors, but the promise that humanity would bring those same principles to their expanding role among the stars. The galaxy was about to discover that the real power of human predation wasn't in overwhelming force or superior technology, but in the ability to understand any environment, respect any form of intelligence, and find ways to thrive wherever the currents of space might carry them. The Amazon had been their teacher, but the entire universe would become their hunting ground.